Look closely at this painting. This is Queen Elizabeth I, as she wanted the world to see her. This is the Armada portrait, a masterpiece of propaganda. We see a queen at the height of her power, her hand resting confidently on a globe, her expression serene, her skin as white and flawless as porcelain. She's surrounded by symbols of her majesty, pearls the size of grapes, a dress that looks like a celestial map, and glimpses of the victorious English fleet in the background. This is not a woman. This is an idea. This is Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, an ageless, untouchable, almost divine being who single-handedly defeated the greatest naval power on Earth. This is the image that has defined her for nearly 500 years. But this portrait is a lie. A brilliant, breathtaking, and necessary lie. It is a carefully constructed mask, painted with breathtaking skill to hide a reality that was far more grimy, painful, and shockingly human. Behind the serene expression was a woman in constant physical pain. Behind the flawless white skin were the deep permanent scars of a deadly disease, and behind the image of divine purity was a daily life governed by hygiene practices that would seem, to our modern eyes, utterly disgusting. We are not here to simply admire the painting. We are here to decode it. In this investigation, we will use 6 of her most shocking personal habits as our keys. Each one will unlock a secret hidden behind the layers of paint. Each habit is a crack in the perfect mask, and through these cracks, we will glimpse the real Elizabeth, a brilliant, terrified, and resilient woman, using every tool at her disposal to survive in a world that expected her to fail. Our first crack in the porcelain mask of Queen Elizabeth I begins with a simple, startling fact, famously recorded by a courtier named John Harrington. The Queen did bathe herself once a month, whether she needed it or not. To our modern sensibilities, bathed in the luxury of daily showers and antibacterial soap, this statement sounds horrifying. A month between baths? It conjures images of an unwashed, foul-smelling monarch presiding over a court steeped in filth. It seems to confirm our worst stereotypes about the backwardness of the past. But to understand this habit, we must first wash away our own modern assumptions. We must step into the mindset of a Tudor, and in their world, Elizabeth's monthly bath was not a sign of poor hygiene. It was a sign of almost reckless bravery and an obsession with cleanliness that bordered on the fanatical. The 16th century was gripped by a profound and deadly fear of water. They were not afraid of drowning, they were afraid of bathing. Medical theory of the day was dominated by the concept of miasma, the belief that disease was spread by bad air, by foul-smelling vapors that rose from filth, swamps, and plague-ridden corpses. It was a world where a bad smell could literally kill you, and the gateway for this poisonous air into the body was thought to be the pores of the skin. Tudor physicians taught that immersing the body in hot water was one of the most dangerous things a person could do. It was believed that the heat would open the pores, leaving the body vulnerable and defenseless against any passing miasma. A public bathhouse with its steam and crowds was seen as a death trap, a place you went to literally invite the plague into your bloodstream. Even a private bath was a calculated risk. As a result, most people in the Tudor era, from the poorest peasant to the richest noble, almost never fully submerged their bodies in water. King James I, Elizabeth's successor, was said to have only ever washed his fingertips his entire life. So how did they stay clean? The Tudor concept of hygiene was based on a dry, clean philosophy, and the key was linen. Everyone who could afford it wore an undershirt or a smock for women, made of fine white linen. This was their true underwear, and it was the workhorse of their personal hygiene. Linen is a highly absorbent material, and the belief was that the linen garment would draw the filth and sweat out of the body. A person would change their linen undergarments daily, or even multiple times a day if they were wealthy. The whiteness of your visible linen, your collar and cuffs, was a public declaration of your cleanliness. A clean, bright white collar meant you were healthy, wealthy, and pure. A grimy collar meant you were poor and likely diseased. Beyond the linen, washing consisted of carefully wiping the face, neck, and hands with a damp cloth, sometimes scented with rosewater or other perfumes. The rest of the body was simply rubbed down with a dry cloth. This was the accepted, medically approved standard of hygiene. Now, let's return to Elizabeth. Her decision to take a full bath once a month was a radical act. It flew in the face of conventional medical wisdom. It was a personal risk she was willing to take, presumably because she valued the feeling of being truly clean more than she feared the miasma. While her father, Henry VIII, had enjoyed lavish baths, he was a man of enormous physical confidence. For Elizabeth, a female ruler whose health was a matter of constant national anxiety, this habit was a private, defiant statement. It reveals a woman who was not a product of her time's superstitions, but one who was willing to trust her own instincts about her body. Furthermore, it shows an almost obsessive concern with cleanliness. The very fact that her bathing schedule was noteworthy enough for a courtier to record it proves how unusual it was. While her subjects were scrubbing their skin with dry cloths and hoping their linen was doing its job, the queen was engaging in a risky full-body ritual of purification. The first disgusting habit, when decoded, reveals the opposite of what we expect. It doesn't show us a filthy queen. It shows us a woman who is arguably one of the cleanest and most forward-thinking individuals of her age, the first crack in the portrait revealing not weakness, but a hidden personal strength. Our second clue is hidden in the queen's smile, or rather, in the ruins of it. Numerous foreign ambassadors and courtiers who were granted a rare close audience with Elizabeth I all reported the same shocking detail. Her teeth were blackened and decayed. A German traveler named Paul Hensner, who saw the queen in her later years, wrote a stark description. Her face is oblong, fair but wrinkled, her eyes small, her nose a little hooked, her lips narrow, and her teeth black, a defect the English seem subject to from their great use of sugar. Again, our modern minds immediately leap to a conclusion, a disgusting sign of poor dental hygiene, of a woman who simply did not care for her teeth. And again, we would be catastrophically wrong. The queen's rotting, blackened smile was not a sign of neglect. In the bizarre world of Tudor status symbols, it was the 16th century equivalent of owning a private jet. It was a public declaration of almost unimaginable wealth and power. To understand this, you must understand the sugar revolution. For most of the Middle Ages, the primary sweetener in Europe was honey. Sugar, derived from cane grown in distant lands, was an incredibly rare and astronomically expensive spice, sold by the ounce in apothecaries and used more as a medicine than a food. But by Elizabeth's reign, new trade routes and colonial plantations began to trickle this white gold into the courts of Europe. It remained a luxury item of the highest order, more valuable than many precious metals, a substance so exclusive that only the absolute pinnacle of society could afford to consume it regularly. And Elizabeth had a ferocious sweet tooth. She adored candied fruits, sugared almonds, and marzipan sculptures. She drank her wine sweetened, and her food was often dusted with sugar. This constant consumption of sugar, in an age with no toothbrushes, no fluoride, and no understanding of dental plaque, had a predictable and devastating effect on her teeth. They began to rot, to ache, and to turn black. But in the perverse logic of conspicuous consumption, this very decay became a status symbol. Blackened teeth were a clear, unambiguous sign that you were rich enough to afford sugar. It was a boast, a form of social signaling that told everyone you were part of the elite. While the poor, with their sugar-free diets, might have had healthier teeth, the wealthy flaunted their decay as a badge of honor. It was a trend that started at the very top, with the queen herself. The ladies of her court, desperate to emulate her, would reportedly use coal and other substances to deliberately blacken their own teeth, faking a decay they couldn't afford to acquire naturally. So the second crack in the portrait reveals a woman who was not just a monarch, but a trendsetter, a master of using her own body as a symbol of the nation's, and her own wealth and power. The black smile was a key part of the public image of Gloriana, a queen presiding over a prosperous, powerful, and increasingly global England. But behind that powerful symbol was a hidden world of almost constant, debilitating pain. Dental medicine in the Tudor era was not a science, it was a form of butchery. There was no anesthesia save for a strong gulp of alcohol. Toothaches were cured with bizarre remedies, such as applying a poultice of burned earthworms and eggshells or reciting charms to exorcise the toothworm that was believed to be gnawing at the root. When these remedies inevitably failed, the only solution was extraction. This was a brutal, terrifying procedure, performed not by doctors but by barber surgeons, men who were equally skilled at cutting hair and amputating limbs. The tools were crude, iron pliers that often shattered the tooth, leaving the infected root behind. The pain was so extreme that people would often endure years of agony rather than submit to the barber surgeon's chair. Elizabeth was no exception. She suffered from excruciating toothaches throughout her life. The pain was often so severe that it left her unable to speak or conduct the business of the state. Yet, she was terrified of extraction. For years, she refused to have a particularly rotten tooth pulled, fearing the pain of the procedure. The situation became a matter of state concern. Her Privy Council, worried for her health, debated the matter. In a famous incident, one of her loyal counselors, Bishop John Aylmer, seeing the Queen's terror, decided to prove to her that the pain was bearable. In a remarkable act of courage and loyalty, the old bishop, who had few teeth left himself, allowed a barber surgeon to pull out one of his own remaining teeth in front of the Queen, just to show her that an old man could withstand it. Only then did Elizabeth finally agree to the procedure. This story reveals the hidden truth behind the black smile. The powerful symbol of wealth was built on a foundation of private agony. The Queen, who could command fleets and defy popes, was rendered helpless by a pain that every human being understands. She projected an image of untouchable divine authority, but she lived with a very human, very real, and very painful vulnerability. The black smile, decoded, is a symbol of the immense personal cost of public power. It was a mask of prosperity, behind which the Queen of England was quietly and painfully rotting. Our third clue is the most iconic and the most lethal element of Elizabeth's public image: her stark, white face. In every official portrait, she stares out at us from behind a mask of brilliant, unnaturally flawless white skin. It was a look that defined an era, a symbol of purity, nobility, and divine authority. But this mask was not just a cosmetic choice. It was a desperate act of political survival, and the price of maintaining this illusion was a slow, creeping poison that seeped into her skin day after day for nearly 40 years. To understand the origin of this mask, we must travel back to a moment of extreme crisis, a time when the Queen and the entire future of England hovered on the brink of annihilation. In 1562, a terrified hush fell over the court at Hampton Palace. The 29-year-old Queen Elizabeth I had fallen gravely ill. The diagnosis was the most feared of the age: smallpox. Smallpox in the 16th century was a death sentence. It was a terrifying, highly contagious disease that swept through populations, leaving a trail of death and disfigurement. The initial symptoms were fever and agonizing pain, followed by the eruption of fluid-filled pustules all over the body. For most, death would follow. For the few who survived, the price was a permanent reminder of their ordeal: deep-pitted scars, known as pockmarks, that would cover their face for the rest of their lives. For Elizabeth, this was not just a medical crisis, it was a political catastrophe. As a female monarch in a fiercely patriarchal world, her authority was already precarious. Her unmarried, childless status was a source of constant national anxiety. So much of her power and the stability of her kingdom rested on her image, the image of a healthy, vibrant, and divinely favored virgin queen. If she were to be permanently disfigured by smallpox, it would be seen as a sign that God had withdrawn his favor. Her enemies, both at home and abroad, would interpret the scars as a symbol of her weakness, a physical manifestation of her illegitimacy to rule. Her beauty was not a matter of vanity, it was a matter of national security. For days, she lay close to death. The court was in a panic. The Privy Council gathered, frantically debating the succession crisis that would engulf the nation if she died. But Elizabeth, with the same iron will that would define her reign, survived. She recovered, but just as she had feared, the disease had left its mark. Her face was now permanently scarred. This was the moment the mask became a necessity. To appear in public with a pockmarked face was politically unthinkable. She needed a way to restore the illusion of perfection, to literally paint over the evidence of her human frailty. The solution was a cosmetic preparation known as Venetian Ceres, or the spirits of Saturn. It was the most sought-after high-fashion foundation of the Renaissance, and it was lethally effective. Venetian Ceres was a thick white paste made from a simple but deadly recipe: white lead powder mixed with vinegar. A lady would mix the paste and apply it in a thick, smooth layer over her face, neck, and décolletage, creating a perfectly white, porcelain-like complexion that would last for days. It was the ultimate concealer. It could fill in wrinkles and, most importantly, completely hide the telltale scars of smallpox. Elizabeth began to use it religiously. Over this white base, she would add bright red pigment to her cheeks and lips, creating a stark theatrical look of perpetual youth and health. This was not makeup in the modern sense. This was armor. It was a political tool, a key part of the elaborate propaganda campaign to build the cult of Gloriana. By presenting a face that was unnaturally smooth and white, she was projecting an image of timeless, ageless authority. She was showing the world that she was not a mere mortal woman who could be weakened by disease. She was an icon, a semi-divine figure, untouched by the ravages of time and sickness. Every public appearance, every portrait painted, reinforced this lie. The mask and the queen became one. But this political solution came at a horrifying biological cost. The spirits of Saturn were, in fact, the spirits of death. Lead is a neurotoxin, and Elizabeth was applying it directly to her skin every single day for nearly 4 decades. The damage was slow, insidious, and catastrophic. In the short term, the lead-based makeup would eat away at the skin itself. It caused discoloration, texture changes, and permanent damage. To hide this damage, the wearer had to apply an even thicker layer of the ceruse the next day. It was a vicious cycle. The cosmetic created the very flaws it was meant to conceal. In the long term, the lead would be absorbed through the skin and into the bloodstream, leading to chronic lead poisoning. The symptoms of lead poisoning are grim and varied. They include digestive problems, hair loss, and severe damage to internal organs like the kidneys and liver. But most insidiously, lead attacks the nervous system. Chronic exposure can cause cognitive decline, memory loss, and severe mood swings, particularly fits of depression and irrational anger. Looking at the later years of Elizabeth's reign, many historians now believe her infamous temper, her bouts of melancholy, and her increasingly erratic behavior may have been symptoms of her long-term poisoning. The very tool she used to project an image of stability and control may have been slowly destroying her mind. The mask she wore to protect her political power was waging a secret chemical war against her body. The process of removing the makeup was just as dangerous. Ceruse was a thick, water-resistant paste that could not be simply washed off. Removing it required harsh, abrasive concoctions, often containing mercury, another deadly poison. So at the end of the day, she may have been scrubbing off a layer of lead only to replace it with a layer of mercury, another neurotoxin that would be absorbed into her skin. This was the terrible hidden price of her image. To be the Virgin Queen, to be Gloriana, she had to sacrifice the real Elizabeth. She sacrificed her health and quite possibly her sanity year after year, all to maintain the perfect porcelain portrait of power. The third crack in the mask reveals the deepest and most tragic secret of all. The Queen was slowly, deliberately poisoning herself to save her kingdom. Our fourth clue in the deconstruction of Queen Elizabeth's image is perhaps her most famous physical feature after the white skin: her fiery red hair. In countless portraits and film adaptations, she is depicted with a crown of vibrant, almost unnaturally red curls, a look so iconic it has become visual shorthand for the Tudor era itself. But like the flawless skin, the Queen's famous hair was also part of the elaborate artifice, another carefully constructed piece of the Gloriana myth. In her later years, the magnificent red locks were not her own. They were a wig. Or rather, they were a collection of over 80 wigs, all in her signature shade of red, each one a political statement in its own right. The journey to this reliance on wigs was a practical one, born from the very same insecurities that led to the lead mask. Elizabeth's natural hair was a sandy red gold, a feature she had inherited from her father, Henry VIII. In her youth, she was immensely proud of it, but time and poison took their toll. The natural process of aging, combined with the likely effects of chronic lead poisoning from her Venetian ceruse makeup, a known cause of hair loss, meant that her famous hair began to thin and gray. For a monarch who had built her entire cult of personality around the image of ageless, divine perfection, this was an unacceptable sign of mortal decay. A graying, thinning hairline was a sign of weakness, of the passage of time, of a body that was failing. Just as the smallpox scars had to be hidden, so too did the evidence of aging. The solution was the wig. Wigs were common fashion accessories in the Tudor court, but Elizabeth turned hers into something more. She turned them into a symbol of perpetual strength and a key piece of her political branding. The most important aspect of the wigs was their color, that brilliant, unmistakable Tudor red. This was not merely a matter of personal preference. It was a calculated and powerful political statement. Elizabeth's claim to the throne was, from the moment of her birth, precarious. She was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the second wife Henry VIII had famously executed. To the Catholic powers of Europe, and to many English Catholics, she was not a legitimate heir. She was the product of a bigamous, heretical union. Her entire reign was a constant battle against challenges to her legitimacy, from papal bulls that excommunicated her to assassination plots designed to replace her with her Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. In this context, her red hair was a weapon. It was a constant visual reminder to the world of her one undeniable claim to power. She was her father's daughter. She was a Tudor. Henry VIII, for all his faults, was a figure of immense, almost mythical power and authority. By deliberately and theatrically emphasizing the red hair she shared with him, Elizabeth was visually reinforcing her lineage. She was, in effect, saying, "You may question my mother, you may question my religion, but you cannot question the blood of the Tudors that flows in my veins." It was a crown she never took off, a permanent wearable declaration of her right to rule. The wigs themselves were elaborate and incredibly expensive creations, styled in the complex, jewel-encrusted fashions of the day. They were part of the grand theater of her court. When she appeared in public, she was not just a woman. She was a dazzling spectacle, an icon designed to inspire awe and overwhelm the senses. Her wardrobe was famously vast with thousands of dresses, but her collection of over 80 wigs shows just how central this element was to her public persona. She could choose a style to match her mood or the political message of the day. This obsession with her image also reveals a deep-seated personal insecurity. Elizabeth was keenly aware of the double standards applied to a female ruler. She knew that her body was subject to a level of scrutiny her father had never faced. A male king could be old, bald, and overweight and still be seen as powerful. A queen, however, was judged by her beauty and her youth. To appear old was to appear weak. The wigs were a crucial part of her armor against this inherent political sexism. They were a way of fighting back against the one enemy she could not defeat, time itself. The red wig, then, was a symbol of immense complexity. It was a practical solution to the physical damage caused by lead poisoning and aging. It was a powerful piece of political propaganda, a symbol of her Tudor lineage, and it was a deeply personal shield against her own insecurities as an aging female monarch. The fourth crack in the portrait reveals a woman who understood with brilliant clarity that in the Game of Thrones, image was not just a matter of vanity. It was a matter of survival. The vibrant red hair was not just a fashion choice. It was the color of her dynasty, the color of her power, and the color of her defiance. Our fifth clue is not something you can see in the Queen's portraits, but something you would have experienced with overwhelming force had you ever entered her presence: the smell. The court of Queen Elizabeth I was an olfactory battleground, a constant war waged against the foul stenches of 16th century London. And the Queen herself was the commander-in-chief of this aromatic assault. She was famously, almost pathologically, obsessed with pleasant smells and had a violent aversion to bad odors. This was not simply the preference of a delicate nose. For Elizabeth and the Tudor world at large, a bad smell was a physical threat, a harbinger of death, and her perfume obsession was a desperate and fragrant form of self-preservation. To understand her world, you must first imagine the smell of it. Tudor London was a city of around 200,000 people, crammed into a medieval street plan with no concept of modern sanitation. The streets were thick with a sludge of mud, animal dung, and human waste thrown from windows. The River Thames, the city's main source of water, was also its primary sewer. The air was a thick, gagging soup of smoke from countless wood and coal fires, the stench of tanneries and slaughterhouses, and the ever-present odor of unwashed bodies and decaying refuse. In the hot summer months, the entire city would ripen into a truly breathtaking stink. And in this world, a bad smell was not just unpleasant, it was considered a physical vector of disease. This brings us back to the miasma theory, the same medical doctrine that made bathing so dangerous. It was universally believed that plague, sweating sickness, and countless other fatal illnesses were carried on currents of foul-smelling air. A pocket of stench wafting from a gutter was not just disgusting, it was a potential assassin. This meant that controlling your immediate sensory environment, creating a bubble of pleasant, clean air around yourself, was a critical public health strategy. This is the context for Elizabeth's obsession. Her palaces at Whitehall, Greenwich, and Richmond were kept in a state of aromatic high alert. The floors were strewn with sweet-smelling herbs like meadow sweet and lavender. The walls were hung with scented tapestries. Fires in the hearths burned not just wood, but fragrant logs of applewood or juniper, their smoke perfuming the air. Servants known as strewers were employed to constantly refresh the herbs underfoot, ensuring that every step taken by the Queen and her court would release a fresh burst of fragrance. The Queen's own body was the epicenter of this perfume bomb. Her elaborate dresses were scented with powders. Her gloves were made of perfumed leather, and she carried, at all times, a pomander. A pomander was a small, ornate metal globe, often worn on a chain around the neck or waist, filled with a solid paste of aromatic substances. These were complex and expensive concoctions containing ingredients like ambergris, a waxy substance from the intestines of sperm whales, musk, a secretion from the musk deer, civet from the civet cat, as well as expensive spices like cloves and cinnamon. A person would hold the pomander to their nose when navigating a particularly foul-smelling street or a crowded room, believing its powerful, pleasant scent would form a protective shield against any airborne pestilence. Elizabeth's personal preference was for a pomander made with rosewater, damask powder, and sugar. She also had her own perfumers who would create unique scents for her. It was said that she could not abide the smell of Spanish leather, a detail that courtiers and ambassadors would have noted with extreme care. To wear the wrong scent or to suffer from bad breath in the Queen's presence was not just a social faux pas, it was a sign of disrespect, a suggestion that you were bringing potential disease into her sacred space. Sir Roger Williams, a famed soldier, was reportedly banished from court for a time because his sweaty boots, worn after a long journey, offended the Queen's nostrils. This fear was not abstract. It was deeply personal and rooted in her lived experience. She had survived smallpox, a disease that had killed thousands around her. She lived through multiple outbreaks of the plague and the sweating sickness. She knew intimately how fragile life was. As a monarch without an heir, her personal survival was synonymous with the stability of the entire kingdom. If she were to die suddenly from a pestilence, England could be plunged back into the chaos of civil war. Her obsession with smells, therefore, was a form of royal paranoia. It was the sensory manifestation of the immense political pressure she was under. She was a ruler who had to control everything: her public image, her political factions, her foreign enemies. It is only logical that she would also seek to control the very air she breathed. The fragrant cloud that surrounded her was a kind of chemical armor, a sensory moat designed to keep the dirty, dangerous, and disease-ridden world at bay. The fifth crack in the portrait, then, reveals not just a queen with a sensitive nose, but a ruler haunted by a profound sense of her own mortality. In a world filled with invisible airborne threats, she fought back with the only weapons she had: a militant regime of cleanliness and an overwhelming barrage of perfume. The sweet smells of the Tudor court were not a sign of luxury. They were the smell of fear. Our final clue is perhaps the most alien to our modern concept of self. It concerns the utter and complete lack of privacy that defined the life of a monarch. We think of hygiene as a deeply personal, private matter. For Elizabeth I, even the most intimate bodily functions were semi-public events, political rituals witnessed and assisted by the highest-ranking ladies of her court. This final, disgusting practice, the public nature of her private life, was not a matter of choice. It was a fundamental condition of royalty, a constant performance that reveals the terrifying truth at the heart of monarchy. The sovereign's body is never truly their own. To understand this, we must grasp the medieval political theory of the king's two bodies. This concept held that a monarch possessed two bodies simultaneously. The first was the body natural, the physical mortal body of flesh and blood that could get sick, age, and die. The second, and far more important, was the body politic, a spiritual, immortal body that represented the kingdom itself. This body politic was passed from one monarch to the next, ensuring the continuity of the state. Because the monarch's physical body was inextricably linked to this immortal political body, every aspect of it, its health, its functions, its fertility, was a matter of intense public and political concern. The king or queen did not own their body. They were merely its custodian on behalf of the realm. This theory had very real and very practical consequences for Elizabeth. It meant that from the moment she woke up to the moment she went to sleep, she was surrounded. The most prestigious and sought-after positions at court were not in the council chamber, but in the Queen's private apartments, the Privy Chamber. The women who held these roles, the ladies of the bedchamber, were not servants. They were high-born noblewomen, the wives and daughters of the most powerful men in England, and their duties were intimately physical. They were there when the Queen awoke. They helped her out of bed, brought her the chamber pot, and attended to her morning ablutions. They were responsible for dressing her, a complex, ritualized process that could take hours, involving corsets, farthingales, stockings, and multiple layers of incredibly heavy, jewel-encrusted clothing. They were there when she ate, when she was sick, and they were there when she retired for the night. They saw the Queen without her makeup, without her wig, without the armor of her public persona. They knew the state of her health, the rhythm of her menstrual cycle, and the nature of her moods. This proximity was not a burden. It was the ultimate source of political power. To have access to the queen's body natural was to have influence over the body politic. A lady of the bedchamber could whisper a request into the queen's ear while brushing her hair. She could pass along a petition for her husband while lacing up the queen's corset. She could gauge the queen's mood and advise her allies accordingly. The privy chamber was the true nerve center of the court, a place where immense political influence was traded not in grand speeches, but in intimate everyday services. The most intimate of these services revolved around the groom of the stool, a role which, under a male monarch like her father, Henry VIII, was the most powerful and coveted position in the entire court. The groom of the stool was the man responsible for assisting the king with his toilet, for wiping his bottom after he used the commode. This shocking level of physical intimacy gave the groom unparalleled private access to the king, making him a figure of immense power and influence. For a female monarch, the equivalent roles were held by her trusted ladies. Consider the chamber pot. In an age before indoor plumbing, this was the toilet. It was a simple ceramic or pewter pot. When the queen needed to relieve herself, a lady-in-waiting would bring the pot, hold it for her, and then be responsible for carrying its contents away for disposal. This was not seen as a demeaning or disgusting task. It was an honor, a moment of profound intimacy with the monarch that was a source of immense prestige. The woman who held the queen's chamber pot was closer to the heart of power than any ambassador or general. This complete erosion of privacy meant that Elizabeth was never, ever truly alone. She was under constant, unblinking surveillance. Her every bodily function was a piece of political data to be observed, analyzed, and potentially exploited by the ambitious factions of her court. If she had a poor appetite, rumors of her ill health could spread. If she spent too long in her chambers, whispers of depression or a secret illness could destabilize the government. The portrait of Gloriana, the untouchable Virgin Queen, was therefore a performance that had to be maintained 24 hours a day. There were no offstage moments. Even in what should have been her most vulnerable, most human moments, she was still the queen, her body a public symbol, her privacy sacrificed on the altar of the state. This final crack in the portrait does not reveal a disgusting habit, but a disgusting reality. The reality is that to be a monarch, especially a female monarch, was to have your very humanity, your right to a private self, consumed by the relentless demands of the crown. The perfect stoic image in the painting was not a choice. It was a prison, a role she could never ever escape, not even in the supposed privacy of her own chambers. Our seventh and final clue returns us to the queen's smile, or rather, the lack thereof. We have already established that her blackened, decaying teeth were a bizarre but effective status symbol, a declaration of wealth so profound that she could literally afford to rot her teeth with sugar. But this is only half the story. The state of her teeth was not just a symbol of power, it was a source of profound chronic pain, and her refusal to properly deal with it reveals a deep-seated psychological trait that defined her entire reign, a paralyzing fear of short-term, decisive pain, even when it was necessary to prevent long-term suffering. Let's revisit the scene. The Queen of England, the most powerful woman in the world, is suffering from an agonizingly painful toothache. The tooth is rotten to the root. The pain is so severe, it is a matter of state. It affects her ability to eat, to speak, to govern. The only logical solution, the only way to end the torment, is to have the tooth pulled. Yet, she refuses. She is terrified. The prospect of the brutal medieval procedure, the iron pliers of the barber surgeon, the searing pain of the extraction. It is a horror she cannot bring herself to face. This incident is a perfect microcosm of Elizabeth's entire political philosophy. She was a master of procrastination, of indecision, of avoiding a direct confrontation at all costs. For decades, the single most pressing issue of her reign was the question of her marriage and the succession. Her counselors begged her to marry, to produce an heir, to secure the future of the Tudor line and prevent the country from collapsing into civil war upon her death. It was the political equivalent of a rotten tooth that was threatening the health of the entire kingdom, and for decades she refused to deal with it. She would engage in elaborate, drawn-out courtship rituals with foreign princes, using the prospect of her hand in marriage as a powerful diplomatic tool. She would lead on the Duke of Anjou from France, or King Philip II of Spain, or the Archduke Charles of Austria, for years at a time, keeping them perpetually hopeful and off balance. It was a brilliant short-term strategy. It kept her potential enemies from uniting against her, and it preserved her own personal autonomy. But it was not a long-term solution. Every year that passed, every potential suitor she eventually rejected brought the kingdom closer to a succession crisis. Like the tooth in her mouth, she preferred to endure the chronic low-grade ache of political uncertainty rather than face the sharp, decisive pain of making a choice. To marry a foreign Catholic prince would enrage her Protestant subjects. To marry an English nobleman, like her favorite Robert Dudley, would ignite furious jealousy among the other factions at court. To choose an heir would be to create a rival, a new sun for ambitious men to orbit around. Any choice was painful and risky. And so, she chose not to choose. She chose to let the problem fester, managing the pain day by day, year by year, hoping it would somehow go away on its own. The same pattern can be seen in her handling of her cousin and rival, Mary, Queen of Scots. For nearly 20 years, Mary, a Catholic with a strong claim to the English throne, was Elizabeth's prisoner. She was the focal point of countless Catholic plots to assassinate Elizabeth and seize power. Her very existence was a constant throbbing threat to Elizabeth's life and her kingdom's stability. Her counselors, year after year, urged Elizabeth to sign Mary's death warrant, to pull the rotten tooth once and for all. And for 20 years, Elizabeth agonized and refused. She was paralyzed by the thought of executing an anointed queen, a fellow monarch, her own cousin. It was a line she did not want to cross. It was a decisive, bloody act that she found abhorrent. She preferred to keep Mary imprisoned, to manage the endless plots, to endure the chronic threat, rather than face the acute, agonizing pain of ordering her death. Only when faced with the incontrovertible evidence of the Babington plot, a conspiracy that proved Mary's direct involvement in a plan to kill her, was Elizabeth finally, reluctantly, backed into a corner. She signed the death warrant, and then, in a classic display of her psychology, she flew into a rage, claiming her secretary had brought it to her without her full understanding, trying to distance herself from the painful decision she'd been forced to make. This psychological trait, this deep-seated aversion to decisive, painful action, is the key that unlocks the final secrets of her portrait. We see a queen who looks serene, confident, and absolute. But her personal habits and her political career tell a different story. They tell the story of a woman who was a brilliant manager of chronic pain, both physical and political. She could endure the constant agony of a bad tooth, the slow poisoning of her lead makeup, and the unending threat of a rival queen. What she feared most was the sharp, quick, and necessary intervention. Her entire reign was a magnificent act of procrastination, a 44-year-long masterclass in kicking the can down the road. It worked, miraculously. She navigated her kingdom through treacherous waters and left it stronger than she found it. But it was a deeply personal and psychologically taxing way to rule. The flawless face in the portrait is not an image of effortless power. It is the image of a woman who was a master of endurance, a survivor who learned to live with the rot, both in her smile and in her state, because she was terrified of the cure. We have followed the clues. We have looked past the perfect porcelain skin, the fiery red hair, and the serene expression of the Armada portrait. We have used the strange and seemingly disgusting hygiene habits of Queen Elizabeth I as our guide, and they have led us through the cracks in the mask into the hidden reality of her life. The monthly bath, which at first sounded filthy, revealed a woman who was cleaner and more courageous in her personal habits than almost anyone in her era. The rotten blackened teeth, a symbol of disgusting decay, were decoded as a brilliant and painful assertion of immense wealth and power. The iconic white face was not vanity. It was a poisonous mask, a political necessity to hide the scars of a deadly disease, purchased at the cost of her own long-term health. The vibrant red wigs were not just fashion. They were a constant, wearable declaration of her Tudor lineage, a defiant shield against those who questioned her right to rule. The obsessive use of perfume was not just a preference, it was a form of chemical warfare against the very real and ever-present threat of a plague-ridden world. And the complete lack of privacy was not a choice. It was the fundamental dehumanizing condition of a monarch whose body was the property of the state. When we assemble these clues, the woman who emerges is infinitely more complex and compelling than the two-dimensional goddess in the painting. The real Elizabeth was not an untouchable, ageless icon. She was a survivor. She was a woman who had lived through a terrifying childhood, who had been declared illegitimate, imprisoned in the Tower, and nearly executed by her own sister. She had survived smallpox, a disease that should have killed her or ended her reign. She ruled with the constant grinding pain of rotting teeth, and slowly poisoned herself for decades to maintain the image of a strong and healthy leader. Her strange habits were not signs of a backward or disgusting culture. They were strategies for survival. They were the weapons, the armor, and the painful compromises a woman had to make to wield absolute power in a man's world. She used lead to project an image of immortality. She used sugar to project an image of wealth. She used perfume to project an image of health. And she used her iconic red hair to project an image of legitimacy. Her entire public persona was a masterpiece of artifice, a brilliant illusion constructed to hold a nation together. The portrait is a lie, yes, but it is a lie that tells a deeper truth. It shows us that the power of a leader, especially one who is constantly underestimated, is often built on a foundation of immense personal sacrifice. Elizabeth ruled for over 44 years, navigating England through one of the most treacherous periods in its history. She did so while battling her own physical ailments, her psychological traumas, and the deep-seated misogyny of her time. The story of her hygiene is not about filth. It's about the grit, the pain, and the sheer stubborn will of the woman behind the crown. It reminds us that the great figures of history are never the flawless icons we see in their portraits. They are human beings, making desperate, brilliant, and sometimes bizarre choices to survive and to hold on to power. And that is a far more interesting and far more honest story.